but should primary school teachers be obliged to tell parents if their child is having gender identity issues, and what actually constitutes a gender identity issue? Well, William Connolly is a broadcaster and former editor of Gay Times magazine, and Rhona Hotchkiss is from the LGB Alliance. Both join me now here on Talk Radio. Thank you both for taking the time this afternoon. Children as young as 4 able to change their name and gender at school without parents' consent. William, I'll start with you. Why is this a good idea, and is there not a real danger here that the natural ebbs and flows of childhood, where one day a boy might want to stick on a princess dress and then the next day run out and play football, a girl might want to stick on dungarees and dig up worms and then the next day be in that princess dress, is that not going to get confused for a gender identity issue?
Krista, I think it's always about authenticity. And I think the point that you raise in the introduction is actually a really valid point, which is just around the way in which we consider male and female orientated roles for everybody, including children. And that is, as you make the reference around dresses and trucks. I think that's a really important one, because we are seeing ever more that there aren't necessarily ascribed or particular types of the way in which men and women or anyone else in between should behave. Therefore, I think when we're having conversations around perhaps when somebody is questioning their gender identity, is unsure if they are male or female, in whatever capacity, I think it's always good to have open and honest forums. And I think it's a little naive of us to think that perhaps people wouldn't, even if it's 1 or 2 out of millions of children in the world, that perhaps this might not happen at a particularly young age. I think when you look back at conversations around when LGBTQ people, particularly if you just take the T out of it for a second, young sort of lesbian, gay and bisexual people were in schools younger, it said don't mention being gay, don't encourage it in any capacity. And therefore I think we're sort of in a very dangerous position of history repeating itself, where we're not allowing open and honest conversations, where actually what we're doing is sending the conversation underground, which is why we've got here. Because rather than talk about it in an open and honest way, we're making it this taboo subject, when actually there are very few young children who perhaps will go on to transition, but the ones that do, we're giving them the opportunity to make them realize that they're not othered, they're not different, and they're most certainly not wrong.
But aren't you raising a very good point there? And as much as, sometimes children at the age of 4 or 5, yes, of course, they have absolutely no sexual orientation at that point, but they might know that they're different in as much as they might end up being a gay or lesbian. Now, that might mean that they might take on different identity roles, different gender roles, which might be misinterpreted. Hey, there are many children who don't end up lesbian and gay that end up doing that as well, and this might all end up being interpreted with good intentions as a gender identity crisis on a 4-year-old.
Yeah, this phrase gender identity, it's really interesting, because I always find it interesting that it always comes down when we talk about trans issues in a particularly negative concept, whereas actually I think sometimes it's about people having an understanding, forgive me, as to who they are. Therefore, I feel like having open and honest conversations is always the way forward.
Okay.
I just really struggle to understand why, particularly those individuals that are transgender, or perhaps older, I'm not talking necessarily about the 3 and 4 year olds, but when they're older, why this seems to have suddenly become a taboo subject, particularly when it comes to people expressing that they do feel like they are born into the wrong gender and therefore are hoping to find the right path towards the gender that they should be. It seems like we're vilifying these members of our community, particularly within the LGBTQ space.
Rhona, we're vilifying these people. It's just about young people potentially finding their true authentic self, and it may only be 1 or 2 children, as William said, who are at 4 or 5 that this applies to, but if it helps them find their authentic self, then it's worthwhile. What do you say to that?
Well, the first thing we would say is that we welcome any guidance that makes schools a safer and more enjoyable place for children to learn. That's hugely important. It matters for each child. I think the difficulty is, and I think William was trying to maybe steer away from it a little bit there, this guidance does apply to 4.5 and 5-year-olds. And as many people point out, children of 4.5 and 5 regularly identify as the most ridiculous things. For that child to suggest they are transgender and have that affirmed, we believe sets them on a dangerous path that many will struggle to get off. We are also concerned about some of the language in this. So, for example, 11 times this guidance says sex is assigned at birth, when it's clearly not. It is observed and recorded. And we are concerned that the Scottish Government is building a picture here that does not reflect reality. You're both quite right. A lot of children will say they are one thing and then they're not. We're also hugely concerned that teachers could be affirming a child's identity as trans, for example, without telling parents, and we're utterly opposed to that. You should not be doing things that are that important with 4, 5, 6, 7-year-olds and their parents be excluded from it. Not that long ago, the Scottish Government introduced a thing called the named person in Scotland. It was an absolute disaster because it usurped the position of children's parents in favour of the state. And to us, that's exactly what this guidance is trying to do, albeit it's not statutory guidance.
But what is the correct age then? Because I do think that it's appropriate for young people. I don't quite know what the age is. Do you feel open enough to be able to say if they feel that their gender identity is different from their assigned sex? I guess the issue is, when is that going to be an appropriate age to explore that?
Well, obviously we would agree that children should be free to talk about anything that's bothering them or confusing them or whatever. It's the response that matters. It's this immediate affirmation that is the issue. We would rather expect that children and young people are responded to respectfully and help to explore the issues. If you affirm, you stop exploration because you've said, yes, you are. You've said, yes, you are, and therefore you're even shutting down avenues for children and young people.
William, what do you say to that?
So it's a dangerous path that could potentially lead to transition, I believe, was what you just suggested. I'm really not following why, in any capacity, it's dangerous at all for the 1 out of the potentially 10 children in a school that could be transgender, that we shouldn't be having this conversation. I struggle to understand why the majority should take over the minority. Surely, as a queer person, you know that therefore it's the voices of the minorities that should be listened to, because we're so often pushed out.
Well, first of all, I'm not queer, I'm lesbian, and we utterly reject the label queer. I think we've seen what can happen when you include the label queer. It includes everything and means nothing. It's a dangerous path.
Disagree.
That's okay. You're free to disagree. I think it's a dangerous path because there is lots of evidence that if you simply affirm children and young people, they will carry on down that path. If you leave it open for them to change your mind, if you don't paint them into a corner, there is much more chance that they will be able to be open themselves and look at other issues that could be affecting and influencing them. One of the things the guidance says, for example, is the way that you know the difference between a child who's simply gender non-conforming, i.e., as you talked about, Christo, boys who don't do what is considered boy things or think that way and so on, is that transgender children will persist in their feelings. However, I myself, as a lesbian, was never gender conforming, and I'm still not in many respects. So it's simply not true to say that it's only trans children who will persist in these feelings. If you don't explore the influences, if you don't explore why a child may think that they are born in the wrong body or they're of a different identity, then all you do is paint them into a corner that a lot of them can or won't get out of.
Isn't that a fair point, William? And as much as, again, I can bring my personal experience into this, that in as much as I remember when I was a little boy, you know, one day I would love my Tonka trucks, but the next day I'd be green with envy that I wasn't playing with a Barbie. I remember when I was in my prepubescent years, knowing that I started to like boys and being convinced that I wanted to be a girl, and so completely confused about that, before a few weeks later I'm very, very happy being a boy, being a man now. But perhaps if I had articulated all of those things years ago, perhaps people with good intentions, I'm not saying that anyone's got some sort of sinister agenda, but with good intentions, I might have been perhaps guided down a path that in actual fact was simply me exploring different non-conforming gender attributes on a path to becoming a gay man.
I really disagree. I think that's a slightly exaggerated example, simply because
But
I
it's my
don't
example.
think that
I haven't exaggerated it. I can't say it's an
but I just
exaggerated
don't think
example.
that
It's
because
me.
you have, I just don't think because you have two different days, one way you want to play with traditionally male toys, and the next day you decide you want to pop a dress on it and feel authentic within that space, and therefore someone encourages that behavior, or perhaps you turn around as a female this day, that you're therefore affirming that behavior, which is going to stay with you, and therefore you're going to go down a path that just simply doesn't exist for you. You know, you being an authentic individual yourself and living authentically means that you will therefore live in the way that you should. I don't think by excluding any of these conversations or giving vocabulary to potentially that one child in the classroom that could potentially be transgender, that therefore we shouldn't have the conversation at all. I just really struggle with this conversation around the terms affirming a child's behavior. I mean, I was constantly, repeatedly, all the time in school told and presumed, and therefore informed by my teachers, that I would be straight, and told about male and female sex. But yet repeatedly now through my life, I'm still gay. You know, being told that constantly didn't affirm the behavior that I should go and have sex with a woman.
Isn't that a fair point? I mean, if confirmation worked so well, and perhaps the bias that a child might pick up from that, then we would probably, certainly, perhaps not in recent years, but certainly in the past, we would have had no gay children, because, you know, you're constantly surrounded by heterosexuality, and if it's something that can influence you that way, well, then we wouldn't have had gay people. And in the same way, perhaps having that confirmation around you doesn't necessarily mean that your gender will end up changing.
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, William's a lot younger than me. I can see that. He's clearly very much younger than me. But the world has changed even since William, I think, was a small child, in that the influence of social media and the constant availability of people who will confirm whatever it is you think about yourself is now completely different. Didn't exist at all when I was young. So the experience of children and young people now, we know this from things that they've told us, is that if they go on to the internet, for example, and most children will have access to that on their phones and so on, if they put in, I don't like this and I do like that, if it's a girl, could I be a boy? Overwhelmingly, it's affirmation they're getting. Yes, you are. Yes, you're transgender, and so on. So I think we're operating in a different world now that doesn't quite.
But I think William's point is, if you're not, then you still just won't be, and naturally, you can't learn to be. It's either in you or it isn't. And however much people might try and affirm the fact that you are supposedly transgender, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to end up that way, because naturally you would end up in the gender in which you're supposed to be, whether that be trans or not.
Yeah, sure. We know, for example, from the experience and the stories of detransitioners and desisters, that is simply not true. There's a growing number of young people, mostly in their 20s, 30s, coming out now, who talk about the fact that because they were affirmed, because people were too afraid to question them, because that's what they were getting fed to them, that they believed themselves to be trans because of their confused feelings. We mustn't forget as well, the other thing that this document I think gets wrong, and it gets some things right, but it seems to suggest that all of the mental health issues that trans young people have are because of people not affirming them and accepting them for what they say they are. And again, from the stories of desisters and detransitioners, we know, and from the Tavistock Clinic, hugely disproportionate numbers of young people with autism identify as trans, people with ASD, people with past trauma, people with eating disorders. And if you immediately affirm children as trans, you take away any opportunity to explore the impact of these other mental health issues.
William, I'll just briefly, if you wouldn't mind, but I'll just give you the final word to respond to that.
I just don't think that the repeated conversation and negativity from the LGBT Alliance around transgender people is going to help any individual, if they're questioning their gender identity, be able to feel authentic in any space, never mind within school. And I think if we're having open conversations and giving children the opportunity to be able to feel like there is a conversation that could be had if it's right for them, bearing in mind that any form of medical transition would be 10, 15 years later down the line, I think is a really dangerous narrative, and one that I personally hope stops.
All right, really good debate. Really appreciate both of you taking the time to discuss that in such a respectful way as well. William Connolly, broadcaster, former editor of Gay Times, Rhona Hotchkiss from the LGB Alliance here on Talk